Right. Hello, everybody. Let's start the second part of this very interesting panel. Now that I have the heart on the right place, I hope not to have disintegrate once again a wrong country. So let me introduce the esteemed members of this panel. Let us start certainly with Alison Smale. She has some 40 years of experience as a journalist and most recently as Undersecretary General for Global Communications at the United Nations. She ran the Associated Press coverage of Central and Eastern Europe between 1987 and 1998, including, of course, the fall of Berlin Wall, the Velvet Revolution of Czechoslovakia, and eventually the wars in the Balkans. After 9/11, she was deputy foreign editor at the New York Times and oversaw coverage of yet another wave of wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. She then spent 9 years in Paris as editor of the International Herald Tribune, and between 2013 and 2017, Alison was the Berlin bureau chief of the New York Times. Second esteemed guest is Colin McIntyre, who joined Reuters in 1967, and a year later he was appointed East Berlin correspondent. He then spent many years covering what was going on in the Eastern Bloc with two notable intermezzos. First to cover the war in Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia, and eventually for a couple of years in Northern Ireland during the years of the Troubles, and eventually he came back as chief correspondent for East Europe right on time in 1987. After 4 years he came back to London and continued to cover post-communist area. For instance, the war in Yugoslavia. After retirement in 2001, he worked as consultant for Reuters Foundation. Ever since, he's been training journalists around the world. And last but not least is our host here, Michal Žantovský, who's the director of the Václav Havel Library and formerly Czech ambassador to United Kingdom, Israel, and the United States. He has worked as a psychologist, translator, journalist, and lyricist. He is the author of the biography Václav Havel Alive. In November 1989, he co-founded Občanské Forum, the Civic Forum, and in January 1990 became the press secretary and spokesman of the newly elected President Václav Havel. He's now the deputy chairman of the board of trustees of Aspen Institute Central Europe, a member of the program board of the Forum 2000, which runs a conference right now, and a member of the board of trustees of the Václav Havel Library Foundation in New York. I'll try not to repeat the same questions that we had in the first round, even though there's of course many interesting points. I would like to start with a question to Alison, eventually to you gentlemen as well. Once one is working, especially when you were running the huge operation of the Associated Press coverage of this huge area of Europe, when you work every day as a journalist, you usually don't have time to sort of step back and say, now this really is something big and this is historical. But eventually that happens. So was there ever such a moment where you not only were overwhelmed with what was going on and how to cover that best, but also the moment now something really is changing and something is really happening here?
Well, first of all, thank you so much to my friend Michal Žantovský and to everybody here for hosting me. It's a great privilege and opportunity. And I'm very pleased to see a number of young people in the audience, because what is interesting is that you get a linear account of this history. And we know that nothing was linear about this, that it was a combination of lots of different factors. That said, that's a way of ducking your question, actually. Because it's very hard to determine were there sort of key points where you realize this is really it, or things just basically slid. And with the fall of the Berlin Wall and then the Velvet Revolution, all of which were completed within a month, that was a pretty amazing month. And it was joyous. It was so joyous that it made you forget about fatigue. It made you forget really even about the historic meaning of it, because it was just such a happy time. There was the sheer joy of unexpected liberation, basically. something that we later saw, for instance, in South Africa as the apartheid system crumbled. I think it's important always to relate it to other parts of the world. Yes, it was a very special moment in Central and East European history and should always be remembered as such. But miracles happen lots of places, as do tragedies. And I think it's always good to keep that in perspective. And as I say, to remember that things never move in a very linear or logical way. As I say, I think I've managed to duck your question. But perhaps Michael is going to have a much more coherent answer.
Colin.
Oh, Colin. Where is Ratio?
Well, I'd also like to concur with Alison for thanking you very much for allowing me to come to Prague, which is a city that I love, and also I've had a little chance to chat with some of the young people here, and they seem pretty interested in the whole thing, and they promised not to ask any difficult questions. As far as what persuaded? I mean, my first job in Eastern Europe was East Berlin correspondent, and there the wall was a sort of ever-present thing. Wherever you drove in East Berlin, pretty soon you came up against the wall. So it completely, I mean, I could go to West Berlin, obviously, which other East Berliners couldn't do, but it very much, and we had this sort of thought that the idea that it was going to come down at some point just wasn't there at all. But if it's sort of talking about something where things might have changed, I think probably the Europa picnic in certainly you had the feeling, although at the time we kind of it almost we didn't quite understand what had gone on there, but the Europa picnic was a sort of picnic supposed to be on the Austrian-Hungarian border, and it was supposed to bring some people together. It was right next to the fence, and it sort of got sort of slightly hijacked by West Germany, I think, because they got to hear about it, and so the West German embassy in Budapest went round and made lots and lots of kind of handouts, and went round all the holiday makers, the East German holiday makers around Lake Balaton, because it was very popular. It was one of the few places that East German tourists could go to, was Hungary. And so I went around and gave them these leaflets and said, "Oh, there's going to be something on," and they might even sort of cut a little hole in the wall, in the fence, which they did. And so that kind of was I think 700 people got across, but then suddenly the message got through. You're in Hungary, and then they started going to the West German embassy, of course. And at one point they had 4,000 people, I think, camped in the grounds of the West German embassy, and so the Hungarian authorities said, "We can't. This is a crisis. You're going to have to open the border and let them go across back into the West," which of course the Hungarians were very happy to do, because they were already pushing hard to they were already sort of democratic, bringing in democratic government, and they were quite happy to. I spoke a year later, and I think Alison was there as well. We were invited to Hungary, and we asked the Foreign Minister, Julia Horn, whether he realised that by lifting the border, it would somehow lead to the Berlin Wall going down. I mean, it was a kind of succession of events. And he said, not really, but we were quite happy with the results. So,
Go ahead.
Should I?
All right. By the way, thank you guys for coming, and to you, Jakub, for doing the MC for this. I made an observation years ago that I keep coming back to, and that is that the history makes much more sense looking at backwards than it makes going forward, and this sometimes accounts for an illusion we all sharing. In retrospect, the succession of events before and during 1989, accelerating all the time, gives the air of inevitability. There were the demonstrations, then there was the round table in Poland and the semi-free elections, and then the protests in Czechoslovakia were getting stronger. Then the German refugees came through Prague, through the embassy here, and through Hungary. The Iron Curtain in Hungary for the first time gave way. And then on the 9th of November, the Berlin Wall fell. And of course, a week later, we had the Velvet Revolution that, was a given. It was not. I mean, when it was happening, nobody knew it would happen quite in that way and in that succession, although we all sensed that something was in the air. And there's ample evidence for that in the archives and documents that are now available to us. One of my favorites was the cable that the inimitable US ambassador to Prague, Shirley Temple Black, sent on the 9th of November 1989, 8 days before it happened. Nothing is ever going to happen in Czechoslovakia. The Czechs and Slovaks are basically content with their lot, etc., etc. I don't speak about the famous last words. And so it's very difficult to pin down the moment when one became aware that there was no going back, that this was really the moment of change. And I suppose every one of us had a slightly different moment, and mine came, there were two moments I remember, and one was the reporting moment. We all were trained by our superiors and elders in head counting. That was a favorite hobby on Wenceslav Square in 1989, and we kept counting the number of people, and we knew it was 800 by 600 meters, and you just estimated the density and multiplied by by the size, and you got a number. And there were perhaps a dozen demonstrations throughout 1989, and they all came to 10,000 people, 12,000 people, 15,000 people. On the 17th of November, the student demonstration is generally described as numbering 20,000 people. But if you look at Národní třída here, they wouldn't fit in. And we know now that some of them left the march before the police came in, so maybe there were 10,000 people at Národní třída. And then we had the weekend, the rumors and reports, one of which was ours, that a student was killed during the demonstration. And we came back to the square on Monday afternoon, because the demonstrations always started in the afternoon, and there were 150,000 people there, maybe 200,000. And that was the moment you knew this was over. I mean, it was all over, but for the shouting. And the other moment, my personal moment, came the night before then, and I think you already mentioned it, or you did. You did, when you were introducing me.
Forum.
The founding of the Civic Forum on the night of the 19th of November was the moment when I realized that, you know, my days with Reuters were numbered, because I was writing a story about founding something that I was at the same time founding or co-founding, and so I knew for me there was no going back at that moment. And the last remark I will make about the 17th, which in my mind is the best evidence of first, the unpredictability of history, and second, of the proof that there was no conspiracy, no scheme, no plan, because the important people simply were not here. I mean, the bosses, they were in East Germany, covering the aftermath of the fall of the curtain. Havel was in Hradeček, in his cottage, you know. My partner Michael Weiss was taking a vacation, and you know, this was some student demonstration, which was actually an officially sanctioned manifestation commemorating the anniversary of the death of Jan Opletal, and the opposition, and in our scheduling, also some of us were expecting the moment of truth to come on the 10th of December. That's the International Day of Human Rights, and Havel was already planning a big demonstration, and he was already writing his speech for the demonstration. You know, this all came to naught. Yeah. So that's the beauty of history for me, and I was so happy to live through.
I'd like to add my personal anecdote as well. I mentioned I was at the time in Moscow, so when in 1988, as is sometimes used as one of the signs that the East was about to collapse, when 1988 McDonald's opened the first, well, I hesitate to say restaurant, but a place, you know, an eatery behind the Iron Curtain, and me as a student of the 136th Moscow Ordinary School, called after the Cuban revolutionary Jose Marti, was every day I took the state-sanctioned red socialist pioneer scarf, and in my Soviet uniform with my other classmates, we went and joined the line that took, and I'm not kidding, 4 hours at least to get there. They had to close half of Mayakovsky Square for traffic. So we were there because everybody in the East, even in Soviet Union, which of course, you know, all the information was sort of sipped through the official propaganda machine, we knew that, well, the people across had jeans and they drank Coca-Cola, and we all longed for that. So we stood there. And at the same time, here in Prague, in one of the, let's say, least sort of, well, not in the worst sense, such as Cuba or Vietnam, if you wanted to get a copy of anything, you would have to go to a state-sanctioned copy machine and fill out a form, and there would be people, state-sanctioned people, who would go through that if that is really worth and it could be allowed to be copied. So the communist regime, up until the very end, wanted to maintain control over every single aspect of your life. So getting back into that, with the events leading to the demonstration next to us at Národní at November 17th, but even afterwards, because even if you knew or you felt that something was already, there was no way to going back on Monday, the 2 days afterwards, still nobody knew how the communist regime would react. We heard, and there were open voices of the People's Army, of the Lidová milice, of the strength of the Communist Party to actually
Iron fist of the working
iron fist,
class.
exactly, to use weapons, and they had automatic weapons, and such things almost happened in East Berlin. So let's not forget that still there was the people on top. They did not understand that there was not going back. It took them a couple of weeks. So my question is first again, not only the overall picture, but the journalist work. And I know Michal was in a little bit different situation because you were the person to be arrested anyway, also. But anyway, how did you work vis-a-vis the omnipresent secret police in order to work with your sources and also for your people that were even with foreign passports, maybe better protected, but not completely protected?
No, I mean, nobody had any complete protection in these countries because, as Jolyon rightly said in the previous discussion, they were all police states. I mean, there was definitely a difference. It was not a monolith, but that system of control was very definitely in force. And I think we should never forget that. You should also never forget the ingenuity of human beings at getting round obstacles presented to them. And I think we all found ways to get the story out of Czechoslovakia, for instance, even if that entailed sometimes a lot of forward thinking. And I think, too, that you're absolutely right in that there were all these reminders that the communists still wanted to control every aspect of life. But that, in a way, was what made it easy when it did tip, because everybody was used to thinking of the whole of life as controlled by these people. Now that we're getting rid of those people, maybe we control the whole of life, which of course we didn't know what to do with, and nobody knew. But in a way, Charter 77 was special, because obviously solidarity was sort of its own special case in Poland. But with Charter, the Chartists really took very seriously not just calls for political change, but they examined the state of healthcare or schools. I mean, I truly remember being in Peter Uhl and Anna Shabatova's apartment one time when they said, and now you should all leave because we're going to discuss the education system in Northern Moravia. And to be frank, you know, the cynical journalists present sort of said, are these people insane? You know, this is never going to serve them well. But in fact, it was one of the things that contributed to the Chartists being perhaps a little bit more ready than people thought to assume new responsibilities and therefore to assure for this country, even in its painful but peaceful split with Slovakia, that things went along in a rather organized fashion. And you didn't have the violence that you had in the Balkans, and which also permeated the Soviet Union. One thing I do think is really important, and perhaps I'm biased because I lived in the Soviet Union for 4 years and I'm married to a Russian, but it's very easy to speak of, you know, it was largely a peaceful transition in the Soviet Union. It really wasn't. And it does not do anybody any favors to sort of ignore the aspect that it was violent also. It was not as destructive as it could have been, but compared to what? The purges of Stalin? I mean, this is a country which shed so much blood in the 20th century that it's hard to imagine. And the knock-on effects are still there, not necessarily in any nasty, intended nasty way, but because the amount of blood spilled was so huge. And luckily, that was largely avoided in Eastern Europe, with the glaring exception of Yugoslavia.
Yes, you were. About how did we deal with our sources? Well, in the early 80s, it used to be very sort of cloak and dagger. There'd be a knock on the door, and we'd open the door, and then our friend, would be there with the latest issue of the Samizdat, and not a word was spoken, of course, because we were well aware that our office was listened to, and they would walk across the floor to the typewriter, and we'd all just stood there, doing our own thing, and then they'd hammer away for 15 minutes or something, and then we'd all nod, and they would walk out, and and then we'd rush to the typewriter, and it would be translated, and then it would be. So that, if you look, that's a sort of the nitty-gritty of how some of this stuff was got out. And otherwise, it was a sort of meeting in a dark corner somewhere at a pre-arranged time where you would talk. Yes, it was. I mean, this is sort of late. This is early 80s, and it was kind of
Yeah.
Please.
No, I just wanted to add, I mean, obviously there were lots of times where you had, driving down some deserted dark street, you're supposed to meet somebody, or in Bratislava, for instance, riveting Saturday night could be had, tracking down the latest site of secret mass conducted by priests who were very much important to the social change that happened in Slovakia, whereas the more secular Czechs didn't. That was less of an aspect.
Right.
Sorry, Mikhail.
No, it's absolutely all right, because it's all on the same subject, and I didn't really feel much distinct from my colleagues from abroad during the protests. The police didn't really ask you for your ID. I mean, they came straight at you, so whether you were a foreigner or local did not really matter. My slight advantage may have been that it was easier for me to mingle with the crowd than for people who were some of them foreign looking, but they made a good job of adapting. And their advantage was that after we survived the latest encounter, they could go to Vienna for the weekend. I was still stuck here, but other than that, not too many differences. One thing that we know now and that we did not know then was that there was not just thinking, but there was a planning, there was a blueprint for a military operation to suppress the protests. We know that, and the blueprints exist. We know that, we know who drafted them. It happened to be the man. He was the chief of general staff, and he made it somewhat by mistake of ours to become the Minister of Defense in the new democratic government before we found the blueprints. And Mr. Vacek, for those of you who don't remember him. And there were, on the 24th of November, elements of armored brigades deployed around Prague. And we know also that they never received the order, and that it may have been partly because the chief of general staff, and that's why we just dismissed him later on and not shot him. He did not recommend for the army to intervene. And second, the Politburo itself was not in a moral state of mind to issue some such orders, because they were how do you say politely, old farts by that time, who didn't have it in them without the firm knowledge of the support by the Soviets to issue such an order. So that accounted very much for the peaceful resolution of this a month later in Romania. It was not so bloodless. And as for the Soviet Union, you're right in what you're saying. It's indisputable. But David Cornwell, John le Carré, in his memoirs, uses a phrase that the dissolution and the aftermath of the Soviet Union was peaceful by Soviet standards. Yeah. So I think that's a fair description.
Well, the events of the fall of communism, especially also during the beginning with the Stalinist coup d'etat, which eventually, fortunately, didn't work out, and then of course the events in 1993, that reminds also of things that are still somehow connected, even very close to our history, closer than the 30 years ago that we are talking about. That is, for instance, 2014. The events on the square of Maidan, where that is still a post-communist era, Ukraine trying to find their way, and then opposing forces, etc. But you come to a moment which really reminds of what was going at the beginning in Temeshwar, and then eventually also in the streets of Bucharest at the end of 1989, where the journalists who were covering things there and who were, as you nicely pointed out, working cloak and dagger, eventually turned out to be pretty much war correspondents, because people were dying by the dozens, and then nobody had a flak jacket because nobody had thought that of bringing one. Well, we did have one in Maidan because we were already traveling from Tel Aviv, so we already knew better at the time, thanks to history. But my question concerns one thing that interconnects such not necessarily violent, but very quick changes in society, in the regime, and that applies to back then as to today, and that is false news. And obviously I'm pointing out to a moment which has been mentioned several times here right now, and also in the previous round of our discussion, and that is the false news of death of a student called Martin Schmid, which eventually turned out not to be true. Now, if I have my information correct, you guys did not run the story where you guys did. So I'm very much interested, and if we can start with Michael, because he was there with Petr Uhl, how this story materialized, and then eventually why AP decided not to go and Reuters did.
Yes, well, we indeed filed the story on the 18th of November. Mm-hmm. And we know now that it was not true, but I often speak about it, and I describe it as an honest mistake that was easy to make in the fog of the protests, and it was first broadcast by RFE, and it was important. The timing of that was somewhat important, because a year or two later I came, as many other people, to be investigated by the Independent Commission on the investigation of the events of the 17th of November. It was a very serious affair. And they had this copy of my copy of 18th November in their files, and they wanted to know about the circumstances which I will yet describe. And I told them all about it, and then they said, well, you're saying that RFE broadcast it first, and yet we see, Mr. Zantowski, in the timestamp of your story that you filed it half an hour before the RFE broadcasted. So what about that? And I looked at the paper, looked at the story, and said, you know, there are these 3 little letters after the timestamp that says GMT. And
That was close.
And so I got away, and but the reporting of it was easy. I mean, we did hear the rumors. We did have Peter Uhl, who confirmed it on the basis of an eyewitness report, and we, by the book, were looking for a second source. And we did find a second source in the late Václav Benda, in whose house at Karlovo náměstí there was an eyewitness who also confirmed the story. What we did not find out at the moment was that it was the same eyewitness for both Uhl and Benda, this lady named Dražská, who turned out to be a highly emotional and unreliable eyewitness, although she apparently saw someone lying on the ground. There's still dispute whether the person lying on the ground was this Lieutenant Zivchak of the secret police or not. But anyway, we had 2 sources, we reported it, then we went to Realistické divadlo, where we got together with other people, and there was also Jana Šmídová, the Czech journalist of, I think, of Svobodné slovo, who was on the side of the angels, and she was allegedly the mother of Martin Schmidt, and she told us he's definitely alive, so we were looking for another Martin Schmidt. There were apparently 2 at the mathematical physical faculty of the university. The guy was also alive. So by Sunday we knew we were wrong. We confirmed we were wrong. We filed the government denial, and that was it. But you know, in one way or another, we have become a small part of history, just as the RFE before us. Peter Brod, I'm sorry, I'm not moderating this. Jakub, you...
All right, let's just make a short one, please.
Thank you. My name is Peter Brod. I was an editor at the RFE-RL at the time, and my recollection is quite different. And maybe Ross Johnson can confirm that. My recollection is, and because I was involved, that RFE was the last of the big 3, if I may say so, BBC, the Voice of America, and Radio Free Europe, to broadcast the news, because we were not sure of its truth. Our source was the East European Information Agency of Peter Uhl, and throughout Saturday we sat on the news. There came the evening of Saturday the 18th, and pressure was mounting also within RFE to broadcast the news. But I was in close contact with Pavel Pecháček, who was the head of the Czechoslovak service at the time, Lida Rakušanová, who was on duty as the internal affairs editor, and me. I was sort of was involved because I was sitting at home at my parents' place west of Munich and listening to as much as I could from the world media offerings, and we constantly exchanged telephone calls, and I advised against going with the news because it was against the guidelines of RFE-RL. And Pavel Pecháček concurred for the time being. Then the BBC went ahead with broadcasting the news about, I think their main news broadcast in Czech was at 6 at the time. Then came the Voice of America at about 8 o'clock, I think. And it was then that I called Pavel Pecháček and Lida Rakušanová and said, look, both the BBC and the Voice of America have broadcast the item. At this point, we can broadcast it saying that Western media plus BBC and the Voice of America were airing this news. So let's go, because otherwise we would lose face, so to speak, if we were silent on the item. But we made this sort of insurance policy of mentioning the other media.
Well, yes, of course, I would say. There is a pressure in these circumstances to publish, especially when you see that the others are publishing. We all sat on it throughout the day because we realized how combustive the news is, and we spent most of the day trying to verify. So all of us, as far as I remember, filed in the evening. And but if you were not the first, you will have to go back to Wikipedia and correct it, because it gives you the primacy.
Maybe in front of the commission of the students in 89. Short one, please.
Just briefly, yeah.
Yes,
It's on, yeah. I came back to this too, Michael, and put together a piece which is it's on ourferal.org in the press room, November 16th, 2009, Unraveling the Schmidt death story, which is pretty much along the lines that Peter Brudd has just said, differs slightly from you, Michael. Anyway, any of you interested in the detail of the story might have a look. If any of you have any corrections to what I wrote, please pass them along. And doesn't it show the difficulty of really being sure about something in such a chaotic and confused situation, even if you're trying to do the right thing with two sources?
Can I just say one thing?
Oh, obviously. And we get back to the order.
I'll be brutally frank here in the sense that when this was all unfolding, November the 17th had found me in Leipzig. The Associated Press had ordered after the Berlin Wall fell that no correspondent who was on German territory should leave without specific permission from New York. On 17th of November, there were thousands of people here on the streets in Prague and in Bratislava and in Sofia. And my office in Vienna called me in Leipzig and said, we really think you should come back. I called New York, they concurred. And basically on the Saturday, Sunday, when this whole debate over Martin Schmidt unfolded, I was traveling. Now, clearly I was in touch with the office as well. And the basic truth is we didn't report it because we couldn't find two sources. Now, maybe it could have turned out that there were the sources out there, and we would have looked not stupid, but perhaps a little bit slow if we had not found this out. As it happened, I really don't think there was a dead Martin Schmidt, and we didn't have any reason to report that. The people who in Vienna and in Prague who valiantly insisted that they could not go with the story came under a great deal of pressure. And somebody in New York in the Associated Press decided to find a way to introduce the possibility that a student had died. I can't remember what sourcing they devised, but it wasn't very clear. And I think it made clear that we actually did not know that there was a Martin Schmidt who had died. It's hard outside of Czechoslovakia to find anybody who remembers this very clearly. I just would like to note. But it just is an invaluable lesson in deciding to have the right number of sources. And that if you have a rule that says you have two, it has to be stuck to. But it's easy for me to sit here and say that, God knows how many years after the event, and when the pressure was really strong.
You may wonder why I'm rather silent on this, as I was the boss, as it were. I was in East Germany as well, and by the time by the time I arrived back, well, it was there. The story was already, I wasn't going to. I mean, what did we do? We pointed. Did we point out at some point that
we didn't retract it. We corrected it.
We corrected it. Yeah. So.
But I think it's an important moment, as you mentioned. This is a very nice case study of you have people in uncharted territory. Things are moving, and things are not moving in one city. They're moving in all around, say, Central Europe, and that happens. And I remember pretty much a story that was not as combustible, certainly, but I was really at the moment in 2014. There appeared to be two sources about a story of 3 Czechs being apprehended by the Peshmerga Iraqi Kurdish forces in northern Iraq around Mosul at the moment where Islamic State was still sort of conquering areas around. And we talked to a person who claimed, I was a very high-ranking official at the Kurdish Autonomous Region Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that said that I've spoken to a person who has seen 3 Czech passports, and eventually via Czech ambassador in Baghdad, unofficially another source pretty much looked very, very, very much on top of the news, and then they said, yes, this is the case. Well, guess what? Well, we didn't Czech television didn't go with the story. 2 other media did, and eventually it turned out that those people not only had Russian Federation passports, but they were Chechen, not Czech. I mean, it may sound close. It's happened to us several times, but it was near miss. And to have a Chechen fighter within the ranks of Islamic State, that's not such a big story anyway. So those things happen when things are moving. You mentioned both of you, all 3 of you, and also you gentlemen before. Things were happening at the same time in a pretty wide area of Europe. Things were happening very fast in Berlin, eventually in East Germany, at least in the surroundings, then Hungary, then Poland, etc. Now Czechoslovakia all of a sudden. Yet there is also one very important thing that happens in journalism very often, and that is, we all do have our audiences, right? And especially when you work for a public TV, public radio, it's much easier. But when you work for an organization that relies on the money that comes from the market, it means that there is such thing as the viewers or the listeners or the readers starting to be, disinterested, I would say bored, but let's say out of respect of what was going on 30 years ago. And the story of communism eventually falling in East Central Europe had many big hits, such as the fall of Berlin Wall, eventually the Velvet Revolution, and then the short but very bloody civil war in Romania. But eventually those things took a couple of weeks, if not months, if we're starting at the beginning of 89. How did you deal with that? How hard was it to actually push, or as we say internally, sell the stories from this part of the world? And we're talking about, I think Jolien mentioned that, the Tiananmen tragedy that happened pretty much before that. So this was certainly not the only part of the world where things were happening. Always you had Central and South America, you had African stories, you had Middle Eastern stories, etc. So this was just, as it is today, one part of the world. So how hard was it eventually to, again, push the stories from your regions to the headquarters, still to be able to have the resources in people and in money, and obviously for them then eventually to sort of, quotation marks, sell it to the audiences or to TV and stations and newspapers, etc.?
Well, I mean, obviously the rush of events in the fall of 1989 unfolded at a pace that was sort of unusually full of adrenaline. And it took a while to be able to take a step back and say, well, okay, so what has happened really, and what kind of coverage is it going to demand? I remember we had a visit from a senior editor with the Associated Press in New York, and discussed with him over dinner what sort of coverage he might expect. And he was absolutely euphoric and, we'll need a bureau here and a bureau there, and yes, we must, pay journalists better, and perhaps we bring in some more people. And the other extreme of this discussion was a very senior correspondent, i.e. a man who had not spent time editing things or selling copy, but writing and reporting. He said, I know it sounds very cynical, but you'll be about as interested in 6 months' time in this area as you are currently in Belgium. In other words, not much. And there was still also the whole unfolding of the drama, and the bloody drama, the tragedy of Yugoslavia. And there was still the Soviet Union, which was, this colossal country with a real potential to unsettle everything. So I would say that actually, if we're truthful with ourselves, it didn't take all that long for the spotlight to move elsewhere. It will always be like that. And I think the challenge for journalists is then to figure out, well, how do I keep people interested, having piqued their interest? And since we are sitting in the library devoted to Václav Havel, one of the master timers in politics and a man of theatre also, I think, he showed a very clear way in which to try and keep people interested. One of the things I think that he most preciously did was to use language in a way that made it very important and made the nuances of meaning of words very important. And that is something that in Central and Eastern Europe has always been interesting, and I would argue sort of essential, because these are countries that don't have huge amounts of military weight to throw around, or indeed even commercial weight. But what they do have is cultural identity and very careful cultivation of that. So I think if the coverage taught us anything, it was to keep listening to people like Václav Havel, who really had made the difference between being ready for a revolution and less ready for a revolution. So the thought I have really is it's wonderful to be here in Prague and to remember Václav Havel for this kind of contribution, because it's the kind of thing that you cannot measure in your own lives in terms of how much material good and luxury do you enjoy. It just is very much something spiritual, if you like, but not necessarily religious as such. It's culture in a broader sense. I know that sounds very preachy, but I do think it has served well as a guidance for when coverage is important and when it isn't, or when it's less important.
Something you mentioned, just to turn us, we are talking about the written press here, and particularly we're talking about news agencies, because we're both agency, me my whole life, and Alison for a certain amount of hers.
Yeah.
You mentioned Romania, the Romanian coverage, which actually was actually really very interesting. It was very. I know you had someone in Romania, and
Yes.
I'm not sure how much he was able to get out. But the fascinating thing about the downfall of Ceausescu is that all of these East European, Central European, the news agencies, the Polish, Czechs, TASS, all of these countries that had their revolutions, but they were still accredited to, and suddenly they were able to act like real journalists. Some of the reports done by the Polish news, TASS, wonderful stuff. I mean, it was just scintillating. This is obviously what they've been trying to do all their lives. And suddenly now that they had a story, and did they tell it? They certainly did.
Yeah.
It was terrific read.
My favorite example was, so the man you mentioned from Bucharest, we actually had to get him out of Ceausescu's Romania.
I knew him. Yeah.
And when the revolution happened, he was sitting in Vienna,
Yes.
in our office there. And he came out looking pretty agitated on the 25th of December. And he said, Alison, we've got to put out a bulletin. They've killed Ceausescu. But the lead on the Romanian radio story, I will never ever forget, it was, the Antichrist died on Christmas Day, which I just thought was fantastic.
Well, it was one of the most bizarre days in my life, although I was no longer a journalist by the 25th of December. I happened to be in Bucharest and have a front row seat on the trial and not directly the execution, but almost, of Ceausescu, because we flew with Jaroslav Kozan, and you were there on the plane, right? Jan Urban, we flew one of the first planes with medical aid to Romania, and when we landed, the fighting was still going on, and it was almost impossible to tell who was fighting whom, because they all had uniforms, they all torn out the badges and insignia, so there were just people, taking shots at each other. But back to your question, Jakub, yes, of course, we are all geocentric, so we remember the Velvet Revolution as one of the greatest events in the history of the universe, but in fact, even in the context of 1989, we were not quite the main stage, because the changes in Poland were far more far-reaching, had a longer history, etc., and it's a bigger country. The fall of the Berlin Wall, of course, was a momentous event, not just for the two Germanys, but for the whole of Europe. So we were more or less destined to be a side story, and and I'm very happy you said that, if we manage to maintain focus of the media, maybe even for longer than 6 months, maybe for a year, It was largely thanks to Havel, because he was the focus point. Yes. He gave a good quote, and he was something so romantic that it was impossible to not to quote him. At the same time, ready for the revolution, I don't know. I interviewed him in September '89, and he said, and there were other people, he said it too, that we will probably die in this regime, although there are going to be changes, and things might get better, etc., etc. But he did not expect the regime to fall down by the end of the year and the country to cease existing in 2 years. But he was ready for the unexpected. That was, one of his favorite quotes of mine is he wrote, I have always found people who are ready for history a little suspect. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a very good attitude to have in my mind.
Well, we mentioned the fatigue eventually that led to the withdrawal of the huge resources from the area, even though eventually some of those resources were lured back by the terrible events in Yugoslavia, during which world, maybe space-shattering thing of the breakup of Czechoslovakia somehow disappeared from the radar. I always tend to say that whenever you are somewhere and need to explain that there is no longer such country as Czechoslovakia, that there's two countries, that we should have invited the world media on the 1st of January 1993 and have two soldiers shoot in the air the whole magazine of Kalashnikov so that everybody remembered that, because no shooting, no dead people, no breakup of Czechoslovakia, unlike Yugoslavia and the big boom, they made sure that everybody knew that there is no such thing as Yugoslavia anymore. But how you guys you have spent so much time covering this area. You have studied the languages. You have spoken to dozens of people. You have invested not just on your own life, but also the agency and the radio time, etc. What eventually happened with all those resources that eventually were no longer needed to such an extent after, let's say, 1990, with of course the exception of the war in Yugoslavia, which again there was the same problem with the fatigue. It took too much time, so eventually even those resources were withdrawn and then sent back, and withdrawn and sent back. Then again the story of Kosovo appeared, but that was pretty much the end of it. So what happened with all those resources? Were those people who have specialized in covering for decades this part of the world? What happened?
Well, I
think we just we are specialists, but we're only specialists. I ended up being an East European specialist because I started in East Berlin. Now, I was an Australian who knew absolutely nothing about East Europe, but of course, having been suddenly in East Berlin, I was an East European specialist and went on to Prague, and so when that finishes, you go on something else. Now I know there are some real specialists. I think Jolyon over there is what I would call, an absolute specialist. He speaks 9 languages or something, yeah, something like that. And he's devoted, his literally his life as an agency. I mean, we had a few of these. We had a Moscow correspondent that Alison probably knows, Bob.
Yeah, absolutely.
Who has literally spent his entire life covering Moscow, but some of us, I think the majority of agency men, sometimes you get there, but if you move on. I then did go on and cover the Yugoslavia and Kosovo and Albania when it went pear-shaped in 97, I think. So I was sort of like a specialist, and there was still more for me to do, But if that had finished, if I was still not, running out of gas and getting too old for it, I would have probably found something else to do. I mean, it sounds as if we're really not specialists, but we can do. If there's something to do, we'll do it.
It's just a general observation, but there was this problem after the end of the Cold War. It was an endemic problem, not just in journalism, in many other areas. All the Kremlinologists in the United States remade themselves into Middle East experts in a very short period of time, sometimes with disastrous results. But this is inevitably going to happen. I mean, what the one idea that we remember from those days, the Fukuyama's idea of the end of history, was never going to play. And if I think it was Harold Macmillan who once said, when someone asked him what's the most difficult thing about politics, he said, events. So that is the best thing about journalism. I mean, there will always be events, and there will be hounds to cover the events. Yeah.
My deputy in Vienna was very soon in Baghdad, right? Where we sent in to the Middle East. The first week we sent in 30 people. So you're wondering where the journalists went. They get sucked into the next huge.
You go where the story is, and obviously the definition of what is the story is partly our definition that we're making. So it's a little bit of a circle in itself, but it's human nature, I think, to be curious, and it's human nature to be curious and perhaps in some way ghoulishly attracted to the effects of violent change. I mean, this is what destroys civilizations. In New York, we're fortunate to live right opposite the Morgan Library, and in there are these most amazing scrolls from the Middle East in little worked silver containers, so finely done that you have to have a photograph of them next to them to really understand what it is. You look at that and you just know, in the 3,000 years since this was made, we have learnt nothing. So we are sort of condemned to repeating this cycle of chasing events and trying to explain them. But if human beings did not misbehave, journalists would have nothing to write about. We do have plenty to write about, and the great thing is you can sometimes get someone like Václav Havel to help you with the task by giving you very usable quotes and a lot of life guidance. But also nobody's perfect, so we can't put Václav Havel on some angelic pedestal. He was a human being just like everybody else.
He's certainly not trying to do it in this library.
Right. Has to be quickly removed with a beating.
That's an angel. That's not Václav Havel.
Well, Václav Havel is the guy with the fag in his mouth there over there. I think that nicely shows how not to put somebody on a pedestal.
Yeah.
And he's lower, I guess. That's the idea. No, well, the great thing about journalism is that it attracts curious people, and then if you're there, you can get paid for that, which I think is
it's amazing.
What makes it one of the best jobs in the world. And truth is that what you obviously, even if you don't decide working for any type of media, eventually are sent if you qualify to wherever you need to. As the example I mentioned, me as the Middle Eastern correspondent being sent in 2014 to the Maidan because I happen to speak Russian, and we happen to have pretty good flag jackets and helmets in our office, which is office. When I say office, I mean our bedroom. We're now CNN. Czech television is much smaller than that. Before we again give hopefully in this not much remaining time floor to the audience. I'll ask you the same. Now, 30 years later, sitting here in Prague, and doesn't have to be necessarily limited just to Czech Republic and Slovakia. How do you see, where do we stand as opposed to the moments where you were running from one place to another?
Okay, I'll attempt an answer quickly.
You have the global perspective. So.
Kind of, sort of. I think somebody's going to have to take it first.
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, exactly.
Whether you think, or where do you see the hopes of the fall of communism in comparison to where the countries that eventually were able to get rid of it are standing today?
Obviously, one can't help being a bit disappointed with what's going on in Hungary, considering that we all covered I certainly covered the beginnings of Fidesz and Orban and is the great hope of them, and well, it hasn't gone terribly well. And then it's kind of rather depressing news from Warsaw that that Mr. Jasinski's party has got 43% up from 37. I mean, this is this is kind of pretty depressing. And the church seems to have really kind of re-establish itself. And I covered Ireland for 4 years, and that was like, I came in '83 at a time when they were having these series of referendums on the constitution, like abortion, divorce, and Anyway, these are things which which had to sense that in many ways the Garrett Fitzgerald, the new head, his father was a Republican, his mother was a Northern Protestant, so he kind of felt that this was I really had a fate had determined that I was going to try, and he argued that I'm sorry to move it on to Ireland away, but it's they've got their problem there. He felt that part of the reason that the Northern Ireland didn't want to join Ireland, it's probably going to happen anyway, but that's another story, was that they were completely put off, the Protestant majority was put off by this very, very conservative sort of Catholic-based thing. Since then, of course, Ireland became the first country in the world to legalize same-sex marriages. So things have really changed there, and that's why you look at Poland, and they really just seem to be going back to where Ireland was about 30 years ago. Yeah.
I would say that we could never have fulfilled the greatest hopes of the moments of joy of 1989, because you just can't keep yourself at that level of a high, ever. But at the same time, most of the territory that we've been discussing this afternoon, I would say that people have more chances to live well than they had in 1989. And if it's about not just human prosperity, but much more about human satisfaction across the board in all sorts of ways, this was undoubtedly a success. And I hear that one of the questions being posed as the 30th anniversary looms is sort of, do we have reason to celebrate? And I'd say unequivocally, yes, you do. And it's worth remembering or asking your parents or grandparents, what was it like? Because it definitely wasn't like this.
Yeah, I'm again very happy you said that. It's for all the problems we are having in this country and in other countries, if you're a journalist, I think you would have to be brain dead not to see the contrast between what this part of the world looked like 30 years ago and what it looks like today. And that's not just this country. The change in Poland has been perhaps even more enormous than it was here. So for all the things we don't like about the current Polish government, the Hungarian government is a little bit more of a problem. I still think that there is nothing that's irreversible here, that the irreversible change already happened, and that was the change for the better. However, Ferdinand Peroutka once wrote that journalists do not write about the roof layers not falling off the roof, but they write about falling off the roof. So it's just as well that people like you and many others, people like Jakub, can see the problems, can write about the problems, and can educate the people about the problems, because the education is a big part of the problem. And the last thing I'm going to say is that I am not much of a fan of the description of the current problems in Europe as the problems of the backward East and the progressive West. I think the problems we're having are pan-European problems these days in various degrees, in various measures. We were just discussing earlier today with Alison, what happened a few days ago in Spain. Is to send people to jail for 13 years for having a referendum. Let's be fair. I mean, this is something that we should also be talking about, and what bothers me is that there is a definite reluctance in parts of Europe to even discuss it as a problem, while we are so happy to discuss the Polish and Hungarian and our problems, and they're real problems. I mean, there's no denying that, but let's keep it in perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that would be very nice moments to stop, but I promise we still have 5 more minutes, so if somebody has a short question, please.
Prepáčte, ja som prišiel neskôr, ale mám otázku na pána Žantovského. Pán Žantovský, pokúsime taký trik. Ja vám dám otázku v slovenčine, ale poprosím, keby ste na ňu mohli odpovedať po anglicky. Môžem sa tak dohodnúť?
Skúsim to, no ja...
Ušetríte mi prácu potom, prekladať to. Mám na vás takúto otázku. Neviem, či nebude mimo kontext, ale myslím, že nemôže byť v tejto knižnici. My sa nachádzame teraz v knižnici a kniha je Sila slova. Stále sa teraz hovorí o odkaze Václava Havla. Spomínalo sa to aj u Vlasty Chramostovej, oslove. Mne sa zdá, že v poslednom čase slov máme strašne veľa, záplavu z každej strany. Chcem vám položiť takú otázku. Není náhodou sila Václava Havla v Číne? Tá odvaha, že vtedy mal, lebo viete čo, ja v poslednom čase mám taký pocit v tejto krajine, bo nechodím na Slovensko, že začína byť znovu pomaly treba odvahu prihlásiť sa k Havlovi. Neviem, v akých kruhoch sa vy pohybujete, ale fakt to začína byť tak, že prihlásiť sa k Václavovi Havlovi začína byť ako hrdinstvo už. A ja si osobne myslím, že odkaz Václava Havla je v činoch, že on jediný to urobil, a to sa týka aj Vlasty Chramostovej. Tak na to mi odpovedzte. Není sila Václava Havla viac v Číne ako v slovách?
I'll translate the question so that the audience knew. What the question is of the gentleman is whether the power of Václav Havel is maybe more in the sheer force of action rather than words. I'm looking forward to a short reply to that.
Well, I'm not sure about short, but it's a very topical question. I'm going to the Frankfurt Book Fair tomorrow to speak there on the 30th anniversary of an award that Václav Havel was given by the Association of German Booksellers, and for which, although he was not allowed to go there, he wrote one of his, I think, most wonderful essays, which is called The Word on Words, and Slovo o Slovu. And he describes in the essay the various powers and the various aspects of word. He describes how a word can be a revelatory event, liberating event, but also how words can be used to discriminate, punish, kill people, etc., etc. So, if you're asking me about was he a man of words or was he a man of action, I would respond he was a man of both, because he believed in the word as an action. And for the word to be an action, it is necessary for a person to vouch for his words with his own identity, with his own sense of responsibility. Otherwise, the word will be just an empty air, empty noise.
Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, especially Alison Smale, Colin McIntyre, Michal Žantovský. Thank you very much. You've been a wonderful audience, and thank you very much for being able to sit here and ask you questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And on behalf of the Václav Havel Library, let me all invite you for a glass of wine to